Going live. All right. Welcome back, everyone. This is Michael Sky. This is the Calling All Men Summit, and we are on day 7. It's Sunday. I'm broadcasting to you from Nairobi, Kenya, where the power has just gone out. It is nighttime here. I got a little candle here, and I'm praying that my battery and my data on my phone is all I need here. But as my backup, I've got my co-host in Medellin, Colombia, Hans Komain, ready to pick up if I drop off, right, Hans?
I'm ready.
All right. So on day 7, our theme is the stress of everyday modern life, the distractions, the addictions, the isolation, and over on our main site, callingallmensummit.com, we have a number of men we've interviewed talking about embodiment, talking about meditation, and talking about a call to adventure. Both Hans and I are speaking over on that website as well. Hans will be posting a link in the comments. But right now, right here on facebook.com/calling all men summit, and on Hans's Facebook and YouTube page, as well as our guests' Facebook pages, we are streaming live. Now, if you're watching from Owen Marcus's Facebook page or Hans's, and you'd like to come interact with us where we can see your name and your image in the comments, come right on over here to facebook.com/calling all men summit. Otherwise, we should be able to see your comments, just not your name. All right. So in this hour, we are talking about how to channel stress and trauma to achieve what you want. For 40 years, our next guest developed programs that brought together mindfulness, somatic psychotherapy, and the science of emotional physiology for men. This new model was the focus of the documentary About Men. His book, Grow Up, A Man's Guide to Masculine Emotional Intelligence, lays out a set of tools most men never got growing up. As co-founder and the director of education at Evryman, Owen Marcus and the Evryman team continue to develop effective ways to use emotions and physiology as tools to create fulfilling relationships and purposeful lives. Men embraced this new model. It's a natural model for men's way of experiencing and expressing emotions. Owen Marcus, welcome to Calling All Men.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Yes, it's an honor to talk to you. I know you've been at the service of men for many years. You do some really intensive work and training with men. And where are you calling in from today?
I'm in Nevada City, California, which is a town in Northern California on the way to Lake Tahoe. So I'm in the foothills of the Sierras.
Awesome. Well, we got 3 continents of men here, and maybe more watching the live stream or the recording. And to get started, before we dive in, I would love to just hear a bit about your upbringing. Did you have a close connection to your father? Was he present? What was your induction into manhood?
I think, like a lot of us, I did not have a close connection to my father for a few reasons. He traveled a lot because of who he was in that culture he grew up in, and probably some other variables. For example, I mean, for much of my youth, we lived on Long Island, so he would commute into the city every day. So that's a 2-hour commute each way. So I didn't see him a lot. And I didn't really have other men in my life. I had a couple male teachers in elementary school, and that was about it. And then I found out many years later starting with graduate school, that part of my struggle as a kid was having dyslexia. And then later I realized I had Asperger's syndrome. And those two things really made me sort of isolated. And when I was younger, picked on as a kid. So I grew up in some ways disconnected from the masculine, from men, and sometimes from boys, and certainly from myself and my own somatic or emotional experience.
And what brought you to this work? How did you get started doing this work? And yeah, maybe you can tell us about the founding of Evryman.
Yeah, I'm 70 years old. So in my just soon after college, I ended up in Boulder, Colorado, which was and it continues to be a fairly progressive town. And I spent 4 years there studying psychosomatic therapies with the guys that ended up being the founders of that field, Ron Kurtz, Peter Levine being two of them, and went on from there. But also I learned to be a rolfer, and rolfing is a really sort of the state of the art somatic physical therapy where we release or manipulate the connective tissue, particularly the fascia. And fascia is the organ of stress. So we store a lot of our stress and trauma in our bodies, and particularly in the fascial system. So I went through that. It was life-changing for me. A year later, after 10 sessions, I was 20 pounds lighter and an inch taller. And the 20 pounds was not fat. It was just tension that left. So that really set me on my path of really opening up and connecting first to myself and to others. I ended up moving down to Phoenix, Arizona, started a practice. It became an integrated medical clinic. And then, I gotten a lot better with all those challenges. And then I realized that my relationships, particularly with women, they weren't bad, but they weren't working. And I was smart enough to realize that I was the consistent variable. And with that, I go, well, maybe there would be something of value if I started working with men. And I immediately had a resistance. Like, I'm not going to do that. That's new agey. That's all these judgments about men's groups and men's work. And I was maybe smart enough or desperate enough where I go, okay, there's a charge here, but maybe that's a sign I need to do it. Did a training, started my first men's group out of my office or clinic in 1995. It was mediocre. Moved to Northern California for a year, helped start a group here. And that was better. And then moved to North Idaho until 2 years ago, where I moved back to Northern California. And it was really now 19 years ago, I decided to do a new model for men's groups, one that I thought would work for me, maybe for other men, and one that really addressed my deeper needs for connection or authentic connection. And I wove in all my training experience in the somatics to create this new model. Asked 11 guys, it took off, and Sandpoint Men's Group is still in existence. We've had over 400 men go through the group. We now have over 50 guys in 5 groups. I'm in one of the groups, which is a Zoom group for all our expats. And the group has continued to grow. And, I haven't been there in a couple of years. But about 6-7 years ago, we took what was working in my group in Sandpoint and leveraged it up to create Evryman. And since then, I've been really working on really deepening the teachings and the processes and the methods of really finding ways to use the body in our stress or trauma response, not as a limitation, but as a conduit for deeper connection with ourselves and with others.
Wow. So yeah, I'm very interested in what your gatherings look like. Could you share it with us? Yeah, before we get into talking about how to channel stress and trauma to achieve what you want, what do your men's gatherings consist of, and how is it different from other men's work that's out there? So we've talked to quite a number of men involved in men's work and men's circles this week. How do you guys stand out?
Well, let me just take a second. I'll actually show you some here. So we started with one training called the open source training 7 years ago, which was like our introductory training, which was based on a lot of the stuff that, I developed with my group. And then we had guys go, look, this is amazing. I've never seen this stuff. I've done other work, whatever. I want to learn this. So I went into my little cave, or actually straw bale house up in North Idaho, out in the woods, and created a new course called MELT, a Men's Emotional Leadership Training. And that's now our primary training. And so when a guy does that training, he gets this book or manual. And what we do in this training is we go through this, which is what we call the Evryman method. And what I realized from, close to 50 years of working with people and now primarily men, that when deep change happens, there's an arc of change that occurs. Now, somewhat arbitrarily, I divided that whole process into 13 steps. And, if you ask me what the 13 steps are, I wouldn't be able to tell you. But it's a process of what happens when we go deeper into our own experience and we connect to parts that we've been disconnected from, and we come back out and we integrate that process. And so that MELT training is literally taking men through that arc, or the Evryman method, one or several steps at a time, and we do it experientially. Yeah, we teach a little, but we put guys in triads where one guy works on another guy and the third guy observes and comments, and we rotate through that triad. And so after a whole weekend, men have not only learned it didactically, but they've learned it experientially. They've embodied it. And more than I've ever would have thought, it's a powerful training because it's a natural training based on our physiology. Guys get very close very quickly, and they develop these skills that I would say are latent in us. We just haven't had an opportunity to learn them and develop them, and particularly develop them in a safe place.
So this training you're talking about, go ahead, Hans. Would you say that this or training, is it different from your main men's gathering?
Yeah, I mean, this is all we're doing right now. The open source is what we used to do, which was a bigger training and more of an introductory training. And we reserved the MELT training for men that have been in groups for a while or had trained with us. But after COVID, we started with the MELT one just because it was an easier training, and it's a generally smaller training. It's, usually 30 to 40 guys, where the other one was 60 guys, and we were setting up to do over 100. But what we found was, because of now, I didn't start out doing the MELT this way, but now that we've designed it around that Evryman method, we were getting guys showing up with no experience of men's work, of us, or anything. The first training we did after COVID, I remember we had a guy that was sent by his wife because she saw this offering this weekend on the site for the venue, the event place. And she said, I think you need to go. He shows up. He didn't know what he was showing up for. He was an East Indian guy from Chicago. And by the end of the training, not only did he understand what he was coming for, but he was blown away and really saw a lot of change, and had developed these skills. So what we realized was that we could take guys with no experience in the course of this weekend, give them a lot of experience and training, so that they leave, with these experiences or skills, but we're able to, implement these skills, in their group or in their relationships.
And that's great. As I've talked to, we're talking to nearly 70 men so far inside of this summit who do leadership work and things like this, mentorship work. And a common theme that's coming up is training, training for fatherhood, training for being a husband, and talking about training rather than like therapy. And, it seems to really resonate with men. Okay, I don't want to just go sit and talk about my past. I want to leave with some abilities. I want to leave with some greater capacity to navigate the challenges of life. So, it is attractive to me as well. What are the skills and capacities a man can expect to leave with once they do this training?
Our goal, and I think from the feedback we get, it happens, is first that they're able to connect to their own experience. And I was a great example of this before I got into all this work. If you asked me what I felt, I would, roll my eyes or try to leave the room. I didn't want to even address it, even if I could. So we get these guys being able to feel their emotional experience and articulate it, not from their head. And a lot of men, and I can, talk about this, we think we are being emotional, but we really aren't. We're just using emotional words. But these guys are actually speaking from their emotional experience. And what I realized decades ago of working with men is, like me, if you ask most guys, what do you feel emotionally? We won't answer, but almost every guy will answer if you ask him, what do you feel somatically? What do you feel in your body? Even if he doesn't have any body awareness, he'll start to feel something. You point something out to him and he'll feel it and acknowledge it. And he has no resistance to feeling his body. Where we have resistance, and we can talk about this too, to feeling our emotions and certainly expressing them. So we get guys feeling their physical experience and then from there articulating their emotional experience. And then because it's a safe emotional space, these guys are received. And as you know, so often in the normal masculine culture, when we are vulnerable or emotionally expressive, we are often rejected, shamed, or just ignored because of that vulnerability. Where I think in any good training with men, the opposite happens. Men are actually honored for their vulnerability and seen as being courageous. And that's a huge, not only mind shift, but somatic and emotional shift for guys.
Beautiful. Hans?
Yeah, I just took note of, for me, I think that's very insightful that it's true. Guys have less resistance and more ability to express their physical experience. And that's a great place to start. Often when I work with guys and say, what are you feeling or how are you feeling? Nothing, And
Right.
but when you say, what's going on in your body? Oh, okay. That's a question they will answer. So, but I never saw it this clearly. It's a great place to start. So yeah, good reminder there.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, most of us avoid and are trained to avoid feeling and certainly communicating our emotions, but there's not the negative connotation about feeling and expressing our body. And then we teach a little of the science of this, but more importantly, we work with the physiology of stress, because as you probably know, we have the sympathetic nervous system, which is that survival nervous system of ours. And when we're in a stress or threat space, we will automatically or unconsciously default to that system. And we have two primary things we want to do. We want to take action in terms of fighting, going towards the threat, you might say, or whatever is happening, or flighting or leaving or withdrawing from the threat. But when we can't do either one of those, we have a third option, which Stephen Porges really talks about and has done a lot of research with, and he's the guy that developed the polyvagal theory. And this third option is what all mammals have, and it really comes from our reptilian ancestors, which is this ability to freeze. And so when we can't fight and we can't flight, or in other words, when we can't take action, we automatically freeze. And sometimes it is a true freeze or a shock, but usually it's a subtler experience. And what it shows up as is disassociation. We disconnect, we disassociate from our emotional experience, from our body, from our connection with others, and we check out. And that's often what our partners feel in our more intimate relationships. They feel us check out, and we're checking out because on some level, this interaction shifts into being a threat. And, maybe we go to our head or we do other things, but we're not present. And he or she feels us checking out, and they see that as a threat response, again, unconsciously. And they go into their survival response or coping mechanism. And it's a whole cycle of that situation, or the relationship starts to spin out of control. And actually the relationship starts to go into its own threat and survival response.
So how would you?
So, no, you, Hans, go ahead.
There's also a 2-second lag. That's why I'm doing this. But I can see the things happening in relationship and how we cope with a stress situation, you know. And some we will retrace, or in my case, I will do I will do even more, you know.
Right.
So I'll fight more, which is not better. It's just different, you know. But how would you? Back to the individual level, how do you start? Because it's very powerful. You say that. How do you start using the trauma not just as something I have dealt with, but really as the fuel to thriving or progress?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. What I say to myself and to my clients and you know, to these guys is that it's like learning any skill. You know, if you're going to learn basketball and you never play basketball, you know, I'm not going to give you a ball and put you on the court. I'm going to train you outside of being in the game. So what we do is we train these guys, like in the MELT training, in a non-stressful place, and we slowly ramp the skills up where, you know, you're able to stay connected to your experience. And that's the key thing. And notice when you disconnect. And so what I'll say to my clients is, all right, we're going to work on some basic skills. We get you connected to your body. And then, you know, I'll talk them through a situation where it starts to amp up, and they just notice when they start to disconnect. And because they have some skills or awareness, they go, oh, okay, I'm disconnecting. Oh, I know how to reconnect, usually through their body first. And I go back to my body, and then I downregulate. So one of the little secrets to this is, when when I connect to my physiology or my body or my somatic experience, I'm consequently telling myself, you might say my emotional self, that I'm safe. Because in the threat response, the last thing that we're aware of is our own experience. I mean, the extreme is, you know, is some animals chasing you through the woods, and, you know, you cut yourself on a branch, you sprain your ankle, you know, you fall down and you know, banged up. You're probably not going to feel it, and you're not going to stop because you're running for your life. Because in one way, we're disassociated, we're disconnected from the body because that is not that important. So the converse is true. When we start to connect to our body or a somatic experience, we start to slow down. Our nervous system starts to downregulate. And we start to become more vulnerable not only to our somatic experience, but to our emotional experience. And once we start to do that, we start to literally open up, again, not to our own experience, but to someone else's experience. And what we teach these guys is you don't have to do it perfectly. But what we've seen is, if I'm doing it with my partner, and I'm not even doing it well, but if I'm just trying to slow down or trying to connect to my experience, even if it's a somatic part of it and not the emotional, she's probably going to sense that. If only because I'm not going into my survival response, which she'd probably feel as a threat response. I'm sort of down-regulating, backing off, and she gets to do that. And then you can slowly turn what was going, and traditionally it would go down in a downward spiral, to an upward spiral of connection.
So is the same, or is it much more than going from being, say, reactive to becoming intentional?
Yeah, I think being reactive is going into our coping mechanisms, our survival responses that we learned. And what I tell guys is, look, we've all had stress, trauma, or what I would call serial micro traumas, which is like stress. So we learned to survive. That was good. We made it. We're alive. We're here. The problem is, a lot of those survival strategies or coping mechanisms have a lot of downsides. particularly in terms of relationships and certainly intimate relationships. And so what happens is, I'll say, yeah, you're in your survival strategy, which is a reactionary. And with that reaction, there's some disconnection to your own experience and consequently to the other person's. And so what we want to do is get it to be more of a response. And response, you're present. You might not be doing it perfectly and all the words might not be coming out great, but some part of you is in your experience. You're connected to your feeling, as vulnerable as it is. You're connecting to your feeling. And so often I'll say to the guys, look, you might not even know what your feeling is. And this is a lot of what they do, in our trainings and certainly our groups. They practice this. And they'll say, okay, I feel my breath is short, I have more blood in my face. My body's moving. They just talk about their bodies, and that helps them. And it often helps the person receiving it. And then that just almost naturally rolls into or back to the emotional experience. And so they go from reaction to response to connection.
I find that women love this. Like when you get present to and you can speak about what's happening inside of you on some level, it's like they can like exhale,
Oh, they love it. And what I realize is there's a finer distinction. Yeah, a lot of the work that we're all talking about and that we do individually and with other men is about vulnerability. And we have, as men, a strange relationship with vulnerability. We get into this work and we know, and we really want to be vulnerable, but a couple things are, happening. One is the whole cultural thing about a real man is not vulnerable. You got to be tough. You got to be macho and all that. But the other part of that is, yeah, all right, we know that something's wrong with that. And we don't really want to do that, but we don't know how to be vulnerable as a man. And I think a lot of that is because we've grown up in a society where women have trained us how to be emotional. And this is not a slight to women. It's just ever since we left the tribe 10,000 years ago and went to the farm, and 200 years ago, we went from the farm to the factory, men were less and less involved in raising the boys. And so women had to step up, and they did, as mothers primarily, but as teachers and nurses and now therapists. So innately, the model of what it is to be a man emotionally is just consequently sort of skewed to a more feminine model. And so what happens with guys is when we think about, or we're taught to be vulnerable, we're often perceiving it in a more feminized version of vulnerability. And there's like this inherent confusion or resistance. But what happens, I think, in all these men's trainings, they start to see men be vulnerable in our unique way, in our masculine way. And one of the qualities about that sort of masculine vulnerability is what I call assertive vulnerability. And so traditionally we think vulnerability is, I'm crying, I'm collapsing, I'm vulnerable physically and emotionally. And that's fine. We've all been there. But there's another part of vulnerability, and that's the ability to, be open, be vulnerable, but take a stance in that moment, to assert yourself. So asserting yourself is not being some kind of prick. It's being, open and being able to say what I feel, say what I want, stay connected, and not collapse into the vulnerability. And women really love that. Now, I will say that sometimes they will push us, and they will push us. And I've had women admit to this because they're testing us consciously or unconsciously, because they want to know, if I push, are you going to collapse? Because instinctually, they want to know if their man, and I think it could happen in other kinds of relationships that aren't just heterosexual, they want to know if their partner is going to be there. And if you can't be there when I push, how are you going to be there if a predator or an animal or a person starts to come after me? So I need to know that you're going to stand up to me, but not be an asshole about it.
Could it be that the whole, say, extreme feminist movement that we're going through right now is exactly that on a global scale. It's the feminine pushing for the masculine and say, please stand up. We need you.
Hans, I think this is my opinion. I think it is. And, like I said, I lived in Boulder, Colorado, which was then and certainly now is a very woke community. And I realized that a lot of beautiful, sharp women there, but they were getting angry. And they were getting angry for what you just said, was they were teaching these men how to be vulnerable, and the men were learning how to be vulnerable in their model. But there was no masculinity. There was no manness there. And so these women were getting pissed. And they're going, and the men are going, why are we getting so pissed? You're doing it, but, you're pissing me off. And then, and then the guy would try harder, and it was a vicious cycle where the other extreme, and I didn't understand this when I was younger, is why did smart, attractive, successful women go for bad boys? Why do they go for bad boys? They go for bad boys because of some of this. They have some masculine energy. They're assertive. They might be jerks and assholes and everything else, but they have some energy, and that feminine wants that energy, and they'd rather have it be sort of toxic in many cases than not have it.
Yes.
Yeah, I love this conversation about having been trained to connect with our feelings or be emotional from our mothers and from women versus men. It's something that I think I was fortunate to have from my father because, I didn't never see my father break down into a victim state of emotions. But I often saw my dad, with tears in his eyes and tears running down his cheeks when he's coming to speak to us as a family or to a child, and he's speaking from his love, and he's confronting us with what he has to say, and he's showing up, and he's there, and the feelings are there. And I had that. I think I was really fortunate to have that.
Yeah, and I didn't. I mean, but in some ways I was fortunate not to have it, because if I had it, I probably wouldn't have developed all this, because, it's like I had to go out and do everything I did and connect all these dots and have this experience or these experiences to really figure this out, because maybe because of my Asperger's or whatever, but I was sort of the most disconnected guy to start with. So I really tried to be macho, and I tried to do it in all the ways, and I really sucked at it. And I just literally gave up. I said, I'm just going to give that up, and I surrender, and I'll try to do it my own way. And I don't even know what that was. And that was the beginning of all this. But yeah, I never had that. I never had my father. I mean, he didn't class, but I never saw a tear. I never felt any emotion from him. And I remember, as he's dying, the last time I saw him, I'm down on my knees telling him I love him and crying. And I knew he loved me, but he never expressed it. He finally did then. That was like literally his last words out of him. And yeah, I wanted to hear that, but I wanted it more for him. I wanted him to feel like, he at least died saying what he felt.
Yeah, with my father, it came through like a religious lens, but in the religion I grew up in, there was a great kind of like what you feel in your heart is very sacred in a way. It's like kind of that's the way that, let's say, the Holy Spirit is letting you know truth or connecting you to what's real. And so there was kind of a sacredness around speaking from your heart and your feeling. And I love that religion, but I very much reclaim that for myself, not as a religious thing, but as a human thing. We all have the ability to connect to our hearts and to speak from our heart and to and to tap into that. It's a kind of authority, it's like the authority of your heart, when you let your heart speak. And
Yeah, there's
Yeah,
a
it's
power to that.
go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, there's a power
Yes.
to that. And as you guys were saying earlier, when all these men's trainings in this safe emotional space, guys get to express it, receive it, and get honored for it. And then it gets reinforced. And then, and it's like those neural pathways are there in us, but they're dormant because in the culture, we never get a chance to use them and let alone strengthen them. But in these sacred or safe masculine or men's environments, a good training, a good group, that just happens in a natural way because it is natural.
When you look back at the relationship with your father, because you said he on his dying bed, he said, "I love you," which you liked, but you see the power
No,
in
he
it for
didn't,
him.
right?
Or
He did say he loved me. After I said it, he finally said it.
Oh, he did.
Mhm. Looking back, is there any way that you think or that you would do things differently, like in the years before that, in the relationship with your father? And I'm asking because it's very personal, because what you said about your father is the exact same with me, and my father never told me he loves me, and I know he does very profoundly. I never told him I love him, and he knows I do very profoundly. I did write him a leaflet in which I honor him, but face to face, I've never said it. Now let me ask you this. Do you have any recommendations for someone like me or your younger self on how to do that, and how to do that maybe better?
I like the question. My father died right before I started the Sandpoint Men's Group. And that was it? Oh no, well, I can't remember. I guess it was before, right after. Well, anyway, I didn't have a lot of the skills I have now. So, but if I had those skills and I had the support in my group, and I've done it for quite a few men, or we done it in the group for quite a few men around their fathers. I'm thinking of one guy that we pushed him to go do what we just talked about because, I certainly had a sense his father was going to die soon, and he resisted, but he did it. He drove out there to see him, a couple of times, and he went from having a bad relationship to a good relationship with his father because he pursued it, and it was life-changing for him. And when his father died, there was a completion and a closeness that he wouldn't have had. So what I would have done is pursued my father, and at least I would have felt complete. And that was one reason, I went against my whole family at the end and said what I said, because it was hard for me because of who I was and everything else. But it was also hard because in my family, you never spoke about emotions. And, anyone that was being emotional was talked about in a derogatory way. So to be emotional and vulnerable was to, sacrilegious. I mean, you just didn't do it. And then, for example, my brother, who's an amazing guy, he was a Navy pilot and flew for, Delta and all that. I mean, sharp guy. He literally left the room because he couldn't handle it. Because we were trained so much to avoid anything like that. And so I waited until he died to do that. In hindsight, I could have been more assertive, vulnerable. I could have pursued it earlier. And even if it didn't work, I would have felt more complete. And like I gave it my best try. And the vast majority of the time, it does work when guys do it.
Yes.
And the few times that it doesn't, they just feel more complete and they get something from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. With the instigated or helped by the work of Michael, I did in the past, say 5 years, pursue my father. I really love that terminology because that could take many forms. I pursued my father. I spent a lot more time with him. I wrote a little booklet in which I honored him for who he is and how I will continue his work. I told him in there that I love him. And I spend a lot more time, and I ask him to tell stories, which is a way for me of honoring him. So I am pursuing him, and I feel good about that. But it's so I've been on the brink a couple of times to tell him I love you, and it just, in English it's okay. I can say in English, but in my native Dutch language, it's impossible. And I'm just wondering if I'm missing out on a big qualitative leap right there.
Yeah, I think we do miss out on that leap, at least for ourselves and probably for our fathers and for that relationship. But I would say that we're also up against not only our relationship with our father, not only the culture of our family or our community and the general culture, we're also up against the epigenetics of it. I mean, I think it's in our genes. We got ancestors that, for all these different reasons, that didn't speak up. And it's like we're swimming upstream against all that. So it takes a lot of work. And that's where like an ongoing group is great, because they have your back, and you can do it in steps, and you're accountable to them, and you process each. So like with this one guy, I'm thinking of, it took a few months, but we've sort of walked him through the whole process. And then when he did it, celebrated it.
That's beautiful.
But I think, when we do all that,
Maybe
we
maybe
change.
you say it in English first, and then he's like, and then when he asks you what you said, then you tell him.
I do know that with my mom, I remember I hadn't said it to my mom until 2011. I was in Panama and met two Mexican women, and I told them that, and they couldn't believe it, and they said, call your mom right now. And I called her, and I told her the first time. But since then, the first way I said it is, don't forget I love you. And it feels like so much easier to say it that way, And I'm getting there, because I'm dropping hints, and I've been writing it, and but I need to say it. I want to say it. Yeah.
And it's hard. I mean, we can beat ourselves up, and we understand the logic of it, but it's hard. And it's hard not just because of us, but because of everything else. But you talk to us about it. You got Michael, you got your group or whatever, and you talk about it, you support it. They have you take small steps, and you make progress.
Mm.
And the other thing I would say, which is we're sort of inferring, is to do it as mindfully as possible. Because one of the things that we often do as guys is we will leap, we will go do something, but we won't do it in a connected way. We're checked out. We just do the action, but we're not present to it. And so, like, I'll tell my clients, or guys, look, I'd rather have you take small steps and be mindful, be present, than take one big leap and not be present. Because outwardly you get the benefit, but you don't really get the benefit of your physiology and your emotions going through the process. And one example of that is that, I've been in several meetings over the last, I don't know, at least 30, probably 40 years, business meetings, where I'll start to shake. And years ago, I made the decision to go with my shaking, which is something that you might know about, in terms of that's how our bodies, in a primitive way, out in the wild, will release trauma. We will literally shake or tremble to shake it off. And I would let my body do that. And my mind's going, I'm making a fool of myself. I'm shaking, my voice is cracking, I'm crying. I'm certainly not going to get what I want in this meeting. But I go, all right, I'm taking the long view. I'm going to use this as a trauma release. And it's happened several times over the years. Each time's a little easier. But out of that, a lot of my old trauma, a lot of my old freeze response has melted. And I really encourage guys to, you don't have to shake, but to feel the somatics, feel your body and feel the emotions as we go up against these things that are so insurmountable, and do it slowly. Because one, will eventually be easier, but what you get will be sustainable. And even if you don't get your goal, you've you've retrained your body, your nervous system, and your emotions in the process. So in that way, it's always a win.
So when we come back to the title that we're talking about here, how to channel stress and trauma to achieve what you want, can we say that when we react and we're, fight or flight or freeze, in that moment, we're either not getting what we want or we're destroying what we want in some way, right? And by learning to be more embodied, more present, and connect somatically to what's happening, at least we're not effing up what we want. Is that accurate? And how can we actually use that to help us achieve what we want?
I would say it's mostly accurate, and I would put an end to that. Sometimes we got to screw up, and it's okay to screw up, particularly if you're doing it, I would say mindfully, and because as Bucky Fuller said, if we're not making mistakes, we're not learning. And I think there's this subtle, maybe not so subtle, belief in this culture it's not okay to get angry. Now, most of the anger that we see and we don't like is that reactionary anger that is really disproportional or survival, or that's a habit, it's a reactionary or coping mechanism. But on the other hand, anger, like every other emotion, has its valid purpose. So when you're violated or threatened to be violated, or someone that you care about or protecting has that same threat, it's appropriate to get angry. And anger could also be, like that fight response where you're fighting for something. And it can be that sympathetic response, that survival response in a good way. Like we have a fellow named George Falla. He's one of the top emotional focus therapist trainers. And George started out in the Army, and then he was a New York City cop, and then he became a lieutenant in the New York City Fire Department, and he was pulling guys or people out of the trade centers. And then after that, he ended up becoming this couples therapist. But he talks about that sort of going for that fight response and being trained to do it as a firefighter. You go into the fire, into the fear, and you need that kind of assertiveness to do that. So I think there's a place for that. So there's this subtle belief that it's not okay to get angry. And sometimes, and I encourage guys in groups to often do this, because as men, and I was one of them, we tend to be trained to be sensitive, or as Robert Glover calls it, the nice guy, at the cost of ourselves and our relationships. And so we need to have a safe forum, which is often the groups and trainings, to learn how to connect to that anger part, which often initially comes up in a little dysfunctional way, I'll say it. But we need to let it come up and practice and work it out in a way that, or in a place that people aren't getting harmed. And what I see in relationships, we often try to work it out in relationships, and it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Could this be the difference between aggression and assertiveness?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a simple way to say that.
Yeah, it's in the work I do, it's I work a lot with judgment, and if there's someone with who judged their mother or their father as being too angry, aggressive, whatever, but essentially the judgment around their anger or their expression of that, violent, whatever, a lot of times they'll go the complete opposite direction, not wanting to ever look their whole life as too angry or aggressive to anyone at any moment. And so they'll let it go, let it go, let it go, let it go. And then when it finally does come out, it comes out exactly like the person that they judged.
Yeah. I remember a classic example many years ago. I was in a group. Well, actually, we had a lot of our groups. We had 3 groups at the time. They were all meeting in one group. And we were sitting in a big circle, over 30 guys. And I just said, we're going to go around. Every guy's going to talk about their substance use. And guys were really revealing stuff. There was a guy that I'd been tracking for months, sitting across from me, big guy. And he said how much he was doing, at several beers a night. And then a little later in the meeting, I said, I'll call him Henry. I said, Henry, you love your beer more than you love your kids. Now, I knew that was going to piss him off. He jumped up without thinking, runs to the center of the room. I walk to the center of the room. He's this close to me, and he's yelling and screaming. And like half the group had never seen this because some of them were new guys. And one of my senior guys says, don't worry, Owen has this. And he's just like screaming for a couple minutes in my face. Then suddenly, he starts weeping and he drops down into my arms and says he loves me, because never in his life has he been able to get mad. And he got divorced from his wife, and his wife was still in town, and she was a serious alcoholic, abusive to his kids or their kids and to him. And he could never stand up to her. And you can imagine what that was doing to the kids. And so once he connected to his anger or his power in this safe environment, within the next 6 months, he completely transformed his relationship with his ex-wife. And she actually started changing some. But more importantly, he transformed his relationship with his kids. But he needed to connect to that, you call it anger or assertiveness. And he grew up in a very religious family where it was never okay to do anything like that. And once he broke through that and realized that no one died and that he felt better, and then he could really express his love, his life changed.
Yeah. To me, it's shocking in the way when I work with men, that to discover first how their sexuality or sex is a taboo, and then I discovered that anger is I would say probably, but definitely a bigger taboo than sex. It's a bigger taboo than sex in our society, and so there's a lot of energy there, a lot of possibility for transformation.
And what we do in some of our trainings and groups is what I call it's anger ceremony I created, where in a mindfulness way, we go out in nature and get angry at one person that we're angry at. And I just had a guy do this last weekend, and it was huge for him. And nature doesn't judge us. And sometimes we do it as a whole training or do it as a group, because some guys initially are a little reserved, but they hear other guys screaming that gives them permission to do it. And it, not for every guy, but in the majority of cases, at some point, something breaks open. Because I have them use their body to throw in, they're using their voice. The body gets into it, and at some point, the emotions get into it. And then it's a real freeing process. And usually it takes several days to integrate the release.
That's so beautiful. So I want to encourage everyone watching this, if you're enjoying this conversation with Owen Marcus, go ahead and tag a brother in your life, or hit that share button, share it on your social media, share it with a friend, a father, a son. And because, we are men coming together here in the Calling All Men Summit. And if you want to participate in the full thing, go to callingallmensummit.com. We are here for a few more conversations today, either one or two. In about an hour and 5 minutes, we will be with James Marshall, the international traveler and coach for men. Hans, am I getting the time wrong? Why are you holding up?
I got three people on the list still to come.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure about. Okay, I'm not sure about the last two. So we'll see. We're doing everything we can to bring. Every man who's a mentor, working with men, who has a big heart, who has something to offer, wanting to give them a platform, and we want to support all the men out there doing great work. And
Yeah.
Mr. Marcus, you've been responsible, I'm sure, for a fair number of men who have done work with you, done training with you, and then gone on to do their own work and their own training. And we probably have at least one of those in our summit that we're talking to already. And it takes a lot. It takes a lot of I think persistence and courage and commitment to stay with it, because it's not so easy to bring men together to do this kind of work. And but it's so healing. It's so beautiful. It makes such a big difference. And you want to maybe close off with a message to the men out there who are listening and who hear and feel something in what you're saying, and maybe want to take a next step.
Thank you, Michael. I guess my message would be to cheat. I like to cheat, and cheating here is use your body or your body's experience. So start becoming more aware of how your body responds to stress, because it does. We all respond to stress, so it has to respond to stress, and just notice how it responds, and specifically, how you sort of disconnect from being aware of your body, your emotions, and just use what we would call somatic mindfulness, or being aware of your body, and notice when you check out, notice when you check back in, and start to develop that muscle, those skill sets of staying connected to your body, which is going to naturally have you connected to your emotions and set you up to stay connected to other people. And you're welcome to reach out to me through Evryman or through owenmarcus.com, because we all have bodies, and using our physiology as a way to connect to ourselves and others is a great tool that I'd like to see many more men utilize.
Amen. And today's day 7 of this summit. So anyone who wants to own the full library of about 70 interviews with great men, and many of those are coming to do a training with us. So we're going to invite Owen to come in and do a small training with our group, get an experience of working with him, ask him some questions. That's if you own the summit. It's at a very reasonable price. And when you do, you get a copy of everything to share with a brother or a son or another man in your life. So come on and join us. Big thank you again to Owen Marcus. Thank you for your time and your energy and your wisdom. And thank you, Hans, for joining us and having my back
pleasure.
here as the power is going away. And you might have to take on the next 2 by yourself.
I want to thank Owen Marcus for I could feel the arduous path he's been walking for such a long time, what he's been facing, and then also to turn it into something as powerful as the work that he does. And thank you very much for doing your work.
Thank you, men, for putting this on and bringing more men to the work. That's valuable. Have a good night.
Yes.
A good day.
You too.